Hi everyone, and welcome to our second flipped collab for our subject EDU362. This is our policy development project, which is our second assignment. So the way I'm going to structure this flipped collab is similar to ones in the past, where we have a look at the things that you need to know to get started with the assessment. Now, because there are 3 steps to this assessment, it's actually quite big, so we will not be able to go over everything in as much detail as needed. We will do that in the interactive collab. We will break down all of the steps that you need to take, everything that you need to follow, what needs to go in what sections, what you need to cover, all of those sorts of things. So this is more of an overview of the things that you need to know now to get started with your teams and also individually. So this team assignment requires you to get into teams. So if you haven't done that yet, or you're still having trouble getting yourself into a team, then please let us know. It needs to be of a team of approximately 2 to 3 people. Probably 3 could be a little bit better just for sharing workload, but that's entirely up to you. This is due the Friday of week 12, and it is worth 50% of your mark. It is 1,800 words. Now, please excuse me if I accidentally call one part A, B, and C. It's actually steps 1, 2, and 3, but they're sort of interchangeable in my eyes, so it should be fine. Let's get started with Rachel's top 5 things that you'll need to know to get started with this team assessment. So the first thing that I put down is number 1, understand the scenario. So if you haven't had a look at the assessment details yet, when you do have a look, you'll notice that there is a particular scenario that we are working towards. And the entire theme of steps 1, 2, and 3 is the idea of digital professionalism, that's going to get me stuck a few times today, and communication policy. There are lots of policies in early childhood, as we well know. This is one aspect that we have been asked to focus on so that we can hone in our ability to develop policy, and we're all working sort of together on the same sort of thing. So, I suppose for us as markers, we can compare apples with apples when we're having a look at digital professionalism, as opposed to, say, every team choosing their own policy. So we're all working towards this idea of digital professionalism and communication, and why it's important to have it, how we're going to write our policy. The good thing about the way this team task is set up is that parts 1 and 2 set you up to do part 3 on your own. So all of the information gathering is done as a team and then presented as a team, and then you go off and write your own individual policy. But parts 1 and 2 help you to do that. So it's kind of like having the ability to sort of brainstorm with people before you have to get started on your own. As you can see, the scenario goes over the fact that we're reviewing policy. So you can assume in your assessment that there is a current digital professionalism policy and that it's coming under review as a part of this compliance check in your education setting. Doesn't tell us specifically what kind of education setting, but obviously we're using an early years flavour. And it's been noted that you do not have an up-to-date digital professionalism and communication policy. One of the teachers also regularly talks about the workplace on social media, and the director has concerns about confidentiality and any legal breaches that might be occurring. So 3 words that you're going to hear me say a lot, and I'm probably going to stumble over them quite regularly, is the ethical, the legislative, and regulatory standards. So a lot of part 1 focuses on these 3 particular things. When we have a talk about some of the things today, I'm not always going to add that sort of digital professionalism flavour to everything. I'm just going to talk a little bit more in broad terms, because this is supposed to just be the flipped collab that gets you started. But when we come to the interactive collab, we will have some examples of some digital professionalism policy and what has been included to share with you. So we have to always remember that we're bringing it back to digital professionalism. So I guess part one, understand that there is a scenario, understand that all our focus centers around digital professionalism and communication and the sort of ethical dilemmas that can happen sometimes with social media, use of social media, and I guess strongly around privacy and confidentiality of the children, of staff members, and of I guess everybody involved, all sort of stakeholders as well. So number two is understand the policy for step one. We are going to research and identify the ethical, legislative, and regulatory requirements that inform the consent and practice of the policy topic, which is digital professionalism. Summarize your findings, explaining how your policy will be influenced by these requirements. So our step one, which is done as a team, and I believe it's 600 words, so not very long. We have the idea of digital professionalism, and we have the idea that it's going to be governed by certain ethical requirements and ethical standards or ethical dilemmas that could possibly raise themselves with the use of digital professionalism within the centre. And there's also going to be the laws based around digital professionalism and also the regulations. Now, when you have a look or you Google laws or the legislative bills and regulations, so we can kind of think of it as legislative law is the actual law of the bill, so an actual law that's been passed, and we think more of the regulations as the regulations have been created by government agencies to implement the laws. So they do go hand in hand, and there will be lots of crossover between the three. I don't actually advocate for you to say these are the ethics, these are the laws, and these are the regulations. It's probably better to have a holistic approach, identifying those things without. They don't sort of live in isolation from each other. Obviously, people would have considered ethical dilemmas, and they would have written laws and regulations based on that. So they sort of all work together, sort of interwoven, if you will. So this is connected to week 6, 7, and 8 of our learning materials. Week 7 sort of connects to the idea, week 6 connects to the idea of that socio-political idea of how that can influence policy. And in our assessment details, it asks us to connect to that. It says to research and identify those three things, the ethics, the laws, and the regulations, and discuss it in a socio-political context that influences policy development. So this week, week 6 that's coming up, is really important about how these sort of socio-cultural political ideals will influence what's happening in the early childhood centre. So it's really important that you have a read of that week 2 chapter in our e-text, because it breaks down how policy is always going to be influenced by so many different socio-political factors, terms of what the kind of centre is like, things like who governs the centre. So, you know, is it local government run? Is it private? We've always talked about early childhood being this vast landscape of different venues and things like that. So that's all going to relate back to this sort of socio-political ideals that influence our policy. So in terms of what do we write, let's have a look at that. How will it look, this 600 words? So we want to weave the ideals of leadership through here, because remember, our whole focus is still to connect with the ideals of leadership. So if you're talking about ethics, it would be a good idea to connect to things like ethical leadership, because you could talk about some of the things that good leaders do to ensure that digital professionalism and communication policies can be implemented well within the centre. So you're going to connect to things like, you know, understanding frameworks mentions that good EC leaders ensure that a quality service is provided and it protects children from potential risks. got another example here. That's so good leaders use ethical leadership by advocating for professional and articulating and demonstrating the positive and valuable contribution it makes to society. They model and encourage ethical qualities and practices, and they connect to the fact that it's vital for leaders to ensure that children's security is safeguarded when sharing information and documentation on digital platforms, and children's rights to privacy and confidentiality is paramount. So we still want to connect to what are the ethical dilemmas potentially that can be faced with digital professionalism and communication policy. So a lot of that's going to center around privacy, a lot of that's going to center around communication, and I suppose a lot of the dilemma could be the fact that social media is great in a lot of avenues. It provides us with an avenue to communicate with parents. It allows us to share photographs. It allows us to perhaps market the centre, because sometimes that can be important, and allow stakeholders to know, keep up with how the centre's running. So there's a lot of positives for having digital platforms within the centre. The ethical dilemmas could come with who is accessing them, what are the repercussions of different privacy law, what do the laws say, what do the regulations say. And this continues to down here where we're connecting to those two specific things. So Privacy Act, Early Childhood of Australia Code of Ethics, social media guidelines from the Department of Education, Child Protection Acts. So it's really going to have to be a research within the whole team, because it does say research and identify. So this is what you're going to do together as a team, and say to yourself, if we are going to develop some digital professionalism policy, what are sort of the broader repercussions of things that we'll need to consider and ensure that we're doing within our policy. So this is not writing a policy. This is just thinking about some of the broader considerations that you would need to consider. All of this is going to be very well connected to things like early years framework and ASEQA standards, all of those sorts of real life connections need to be made in this section as well. So we're talking about the ethics of the situation. What are some of the ethical dilemmas that can potentially be faced when we're thinking about digital platforms and digital professionalism and communicating with parents and stakeholders and community and whatnot? What are some of the laws and regulations around this, and how does it support, or how does it support using this within our policy? We also need to keep it within that leadership flavour, because again, it is a leadership unit. We want to connect it back to leadership and talking about what good leaders do. So perhaps we look at things with that sort of leadership ideal, where good leaders will look at the ethical dilemmas within that and use different leadership strategies to ensure that the policy is up to date and it's complying to all the regulations and guidelines. So that's 600 words together. Start off with your research of the laws and the acts in terms of digital professionalism. That's a good start for you as a team, and have a chat together about how it can influence how to make your digital professionalism policy just really great. Now, your next one is to understand how to collect data from step 2, your team task. Now, this is quite involved. We will go through it step by step in the interactive collab. I will go over it for you with a short amount of detail here just to get you started, but we will look at digital professionalism policy examples in our interactive collab so that you can get a little bit more specific. I have included in the Padlet template. It was just one that we made up last TP. It is not a requirement of this task. It was not developed by Swinburne. It was just something that we put together because a couple of the students had used it in a previous TP, and then I was asked, where did you get that from? And I just shared it. So it's just there. Use it, don't use it, change it, do whatever you like with it, but it was just something just to help. You do not have to use it. It's not part of the marking. It is just there just to help if you want. So it's in the Padlet called A2 template. Okay, the first thing you need to do is articulate your vision. So this is all of the planning that goes into getting you to step 3. So I told you in the beginning that step 1 is kind of a very broad overview of digital professionalism. What are the laws and regulations? What are some of the ethical dilemmas involved, and how it sort of is an overall sort of the 600-word summary of things you need to consider when you're thinking about digital professionalism. This one is much more honed in to our vision, our stakeholders, how we're going to gather data, how we're going to inform that data, what's our action plan. So this is the what we're going to do now. This is the actual implementing stages that lead up to the policy actually being written. This is reviewing policy, getting feedback from people. This is the real sort of active steps that we need to cover. Again, this is together as a team. There are dot points, there are all different sorts of formatting. This is not an essay. You don't have to worry about sort of how it's structured as long as you have these things. Now, this is a wonderful assignment because it's so clear. It tells you exactly in the assessment details what you need to include. So make sure you include these things, and I'm sure that your team will do a great job. So your goal is, your vision is just a paragraph, short paragraph on what you're hoping to achieve. What is the point of this digital professionalism policy? So it could be something like, this policy is designed to protect and guide all stakeholders in digital communications and professionalism while sharing documentation in early childhood and care, with the best interests of children and families a priority. This policy adheres to the necessary ethical, legislative and regulatory rights of all stakeholders whilst upholding the beliefs and values of the service. With adequate training for all and regular technology upkeep, the policy will benefit all stakeholders in early childhood setting. That was the vision. That was from a previous team from last TP. What I liked about that vision was that they talked about who the policy is there to protect. They talked about the fact that it's ultimately there in the best interest of the children and therefore families. To have this, keeping kids safe, is very important to have in your vision. And the fact that we're making this so that all stakeholders and all the people involved in the centre, in whatever your EC setting is, understand how to implement the policy, and therefore regular training will happen. You don't need to write it in that such a way. That was just an example of how it could sound, but it's a short paragraph explaining, what are you hoping to achieve? Why is it important to have an up-to-date digital professionalism policy? What's it there for? What are you hoping to do with it? And ultimately, it's there for the protection of kids, but also, protection of staff members, ensuring that everyone's on the same page and everyone knows how to implement that. Here's another example for you. The goal of digital professionalism and communication policy is to ensure all stakeholders sustain current legislation and regulations in relation to children and early childhood sector in order to provide a safe, healthy and respectful environment for all of those affiliated with it. Clear and concise expectations are provided to guide all stakeholders, ensuring no mixed understanding, keeping in line with the service's philosophy. The next thing that you need to do is identify your stakeholders. So who will be involved and how can you integrate ethical considerations? So most of the teams last time did their vision as a separate paragraph and they did not have it in a table format. But from here on in, most teams had all of the rest of these things in a table. So you're literally going to write stakeholders as your subheading, and you're going to list the stakeholders down. Now, again, there's no right or wrong on the formatting. I'm just giving you ideas. So your stakeholders could be, try to think as broadly as you can. We don't just want to say the stakeholders are the children and the staff. We really want to think broadly about everybody who comes into contact with the centre, because if there are volunteers, if there are community members, if there are other people who are entering the workplace, they need to know about digital professionalism as well. It can't just be staff that are on board with the process. So think about all of these stakeholders involved. So the children, the families, the staff, the community members, visitors, just anyone who's involved in the centre needs to be included in this sort of list of stakeholders. Now, I ask you to integrate ethical considerations. So what are some of the things that you need to consider with each of these stakeholders? So when we're talking about things like, say, the children, so you want the children, and something to consider with the children could be things like the children have a capacity to contribute to their community by having their voice heard and contributing to the decisions that affect them. So if we are making decisions for children, why don't children have the ability to make decisions for their own, for themselves? So that's an ethical consideration when thinking about the enrolled children. What about families? What are some ethical considerations to do with them? This particular team just had enrolled children, families, staff, leaders, and community and visitors listed in a table, and then they had their ethical considerations listed next to it. For families, they wrote, working in partnership with families can support culture of shared responsibility. So in order to keep kids safe, we need to have that collective responsibility. So that could be an ethical consideration for them. With staff, it could be things like building respect and mutual understanding of diverse situations and perspectives, and making sure that staff are valued. Think about any other ethical considerations in terms of the staff. So make a list of stakeholders as broad and as wide as you can think of, and any perhaps interesting things that we should consider ethically to do with those particular stakeholders. We will talk more about that at the Interactive Collab and give you some more solid ideas around that. So in terms of gathering information, again, you could have this, I think makes sense as a table again, but what works for your team is fine. So how are you going to gather all of the data? So you're sitting around, you're at work, you've got your current digital professionalism policy sitting in front of you, and it's outdated and it needs review, it needs updating. We can't just sit with 2 members of staff and they update it and say it's all done. We need to consider all of the stakeholders that we just listed above, and we need to have a whole process listed down about how it's going to be reviewed. So what are you going to do? What processes will you use, and what documents will you provide? So when we're talking about documents, we're talking about, well, there'd be things like surveys and questionnaires. So these particular teams, again, had a list. On one side, they had surveys and questionnaires, and then they just explained why that was there and what they were going to do with it. So in their dot points, they had information that they were going to give a survey and a questionnaire to stakeholders, all the stakeholders, that would reflect things about habits, needs, preferences, beliefs, children's consent and efficiency of the policy. They were going to use surveys to gather information from staff and families about the current policy, so they might give a copy of the current policy out, so that's a document. And they would ask for a review or some feedback on the current policy. They'd ask to have a questionnaire to discover what the shared values and beliefs are and what's important. So we need to gather information from these surveys about what is valued in terms of keeping kids safe in a digital platform, in a digital environment. There could be focus groups, there could be meetings and interviews where you ask maybe focus groups with the leadership team, maybe local community members, where you discuss the policy and how it could look in the form of a new policy. You could meet with children to discuss their opinions on social media and digital technology. You can collect data, perhaps by connecting to things like things like emails and staff professionalism, policy guidelines review, and the quality improvement plan. Again, ask children. So the first things are going to be things more like surveys, questionnaires, focus groups, meetings, any sorts of collaboration, data collection. Another really important thing in terms of gathering information is going to be research, because there could be new laws, there could be new regulations that perhaps this outdated policy doesn't cover. And we all know that things always change. So there could be updated versions or new, technology is forever changing. So when we think about our own communication policy, this needs to be updated with what's in line with what's happening now. So do your research. Both of these teams that I'm using as my examples here have got a section on research, where you're going to research the surrounding services. So maybe other local kinders or centres have a policy that you could use to get ideas from. You're going to look at Victoria State Government using social media policy. You're going to look at external reports and statistics. You're going to look at the requirements of Children's Services Regulation, Australian Human Rights Commission, the ASEQA standards, the Early Years Framework, Department of Education, United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. So by looking at all of these sorts of laws and regulations, you're going to be keeping up to date with what's current. Just pop them in a list of things that your research will collect. One of the teams has collection of data, so they're going to look at things like check compliance register for that are pertaining to digital professionalism. They're going to have a look, locate current data from Australian Early Development Census, and they're going to have a look at the community demographics, whereas this other particular team was also going to look at the feedback from the stakeholders in terms of policy meetings, questionnaires, and surveys. So what's all this? You're going to have a big collection of data from all different areas. Again, I feel like I'm rushing a little bit, but we'll go through this in a lot more detail and a bit more slowly in our interactive collab. So what does the data inform you of? So this is where you're going to do a SWOT analysis, and however you would like to set out this SWOT analysis is completely up to you. But now that you've gathered all this data, what's important to know, and how will it identify your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats? Now, I got asked last time whether it's a SWOT analysis about the actual policy itself, or is a SWOT analysis about the actual collection of data for the policy review. And it's both, or you could take it one way or the other. It doesn't really matter, but you have to review the process of what could be strengths in the ways you've collected the data, what could be things that need to be considered. But also when you're writing the policy, is there going to be potential weaknesses that you could potentially come across, or threats? So what will the data inform us of? So a strength could be, let's have a look, that we're ensuring that the families have confidence in the service and they can see innovation through the collection of data from all stakeholders. Using various methods can supply the service with an array of information that can be used. It informs the service of opinions of all stakeholders using a variety of methods. So we've cast the net really wide. That could be a potential strength of this data collection. So these policies are going to establish a common visible guidelines for stakeholders and provide clear rules of engagement and expectations. Is also a strength of going through this review process. What are some of the weaknesses? Well, perhaps things like the families may not have a clear understanding of the reasons why these surveys are being done. Therefore, they might not respond with honest answers. Perhaps they don't feel like, or sometimes they don't have always the expertise to comment on different policies. I know that I could say for myself, just by myself having a child at a centre, I don't feel like I would be equipped to comment on what things should and shouldn't be in a particular policy. So that might be something to consider as a potential weakness where the feedback is coming from. Yet educators may not have the knowledge or understanding of legislation regarding the policy and the reasons for the development, and their responses may be misleading. So there's going to be some weaknesses in the data. There's going to be some weaknesses in the data that comes back to you, and you'll just have to reflect on what the possible weaknesses could be. You don't have to make suggestions, although you can potentially look at that as an opportunity. So if you want to turn some of your weaknesses around and think about how you could get over some of those things, or your opportunities could be different things as well. Opportunities can be things like engagement with families and other stakeholders. So by going through such a broad review process and including all the stakeholders, it's providing an opportunity to have people come together and build that bond between people, stakeholders, families, children in the centre. Ultimately, it's there to protect children. So that's a positive opportunity from going through such an extensive review process and collecting such extensive data, is that we're going to provide a policy, an excellent policy, which is going to meet the needs of the children. And that it's highlighting the centre as a forward-thinking and innovative practice because we have done such an extensive review process. Threats could be things like conflict of interest between different stakeholders potentially when you're collecting the data, or the service may have a preconceived idea about what they'd like to include in the policy, so the results may change. We will talk more about the SWOT analysis in our interactive collab and give you a few more ideas around that. Your next one is the action and collaboration plan. A lot of the students last time did this together, and they did it in a table. Again, refer to the template that I've given you. If you say action and collaboration plan, you can do these together. Your first column will say tasks. Your second column will say responsible person / persons, and your last one will be a time frame. So you're going to give us the step by step on what you're going to give us, what you're going to do to collect the data, analyze it, review it, get it out there, review it again, bring it back, write the policy. So this is a timeline of how the process above, all of this stuff that you've done, what's the timeline to it? Who's the responsible person? When will they be completed? Who will meet what and do what when? So some teams last time had little subheadings underneath where they said like point 1, data collection, point 2, collate the data, point 3, do the research into the laws and regulations, part 3, write a draft, part 4, give the draft to the stakeholders to review, then finalize and implement. That was the way that they sort of structured their action plan. In this particular example I have next to me, the first dot point was to identify required documents to support the policy, and that was going to be done by the director, and that was going to be done immediately. The purpose of the policy was to discuss at a staff meeting, and that was happening in week 1 with the director, leaders and educators. They moved on to then looking at some policy designs in week 2. In week 4, part 4 or step 4 was to gather information, child discussion, surveys and questionnaires, and that was taking 2 weeks. They were going to review the data and consult stakeholders in the newsletter, community meeting and class discussion. They were going to draft their policy. That was going to take 2 weeks, and it continues on. You're probably thinking, what is she talking about? in the interactive collab, I will give you a visual example of this table, and I will show you in a little bit more detail how it looks. But basically, it's the who's going to do what tasks, what the task is, who's going to do it, and how long is it going to take. Okay, this is your part that you're going to write on your own, and it should be, I won't say fairly easy because that might be a bit of a silly thing to say, but you should feel more prepared for part 3 once you've done parts 1 and 2, because it sets you up for writing this on your own. You should feel fairly confident after you've done all the research for parts 1 and 2 as a team, and you've spoken and you've gotten help and done all of these things, that you then come apart and you feel like you can go off and write your policy now. Again, it's very involved, and I'm already over time on this flipped collab, but we will go through the process step by step in our interactive collab too. Okay, step 1 is your policy statement. This is all done on your own now. So you will hand in part 1 and part 2 like your other 2 or 3 team members, and that will all be identical for all team members. This is your own part, and you will get your own mark. Your mark will vary to your team members because this part is different. Your policy statement is quite a broad statement, but it should be a strong statement about what the policy is there for and what it sets to achieve. Now, obviously, we're focusing on digital professionalism, so it's going to be a strong focus on a just very short, very short, sharp statement, sentence or two, but very strong and convincing. The digital professionalism and communication policy informs staff, students, families, and members of the community of the expectations and values of the service concerning ICT and its use. Short, sharp statement. Let me see what this other team have got. This policy has been designed to ensure that all stakeholders within the service have a clear understanding of their responsibilities regarding digital communications. This will ensure that educators, children and families have the confidence in the service and the safety is paramount online. Finished. Short, sharp. What does it set to achieve? Why have you got a digital professionalism policy? It's there to protect kids, and it is there to keep everybody on the same page. Now your rationale will be a little bit longer paragraph, probably say 100 words. I don't know exactly, don't quote me on word counts, just giving you an idea. Bit of a longer paragraph. Why is this policy needed and why is it important? And use academic research. So we're always using academic research in terms of things that we've been provided in the unit, but that also means things like guidelines, always using a CEQA, always using early years framework to support the idea of why it's important, using laws, regulations throughout. So you want to say things like, so your service recognises the importance of digital technology as an integral part of communication, collaboration and digital technology in the 21st century. So we need to say, look, we live in a 21st century environment, and digital platforms are a positive thing. We need them, we can use them if we use them in the right way. They can provide avenues for parents to see, keep in touch with the centre, we can post work, we can have avenues of communication and make that connection between parents and the centre and children and community open using digital platforms. However, kids need to be safe, and we need to work within the realms of the laws and regulations in order to keep kids safe and in order to make sure staff are protected, to ensure that everyone is on the same page, because it's not just about keeping kids safe. We want to keep staff safe. We want to make sure that there's no confusion between what's allowed and what's not allowed. We don't want someone to not be clear on what's expected and then lapses arise. So you want clear guidelines to show educators that they understand their personal responsibilities as well as the consequences of any behaviours that are deemed irresponsible and can cause disruption to the children. It's their duty of care. These are the things we're going to include in the rationale. Your procedure is an outline of at least 10 steps or specific guidelines that your policy follows. And these are the rules basically on what you're going to get your staff to do. So think of it as very, very practical, and remember to connect back to community stakeholders, use evidence and research for support. So there shouldn't be, sorry, what I'm trying to say is there should be very specific steps that are required, that if someone were to pick up the policy, these are the 10 things that they need to do. Not just staff, not just parents, but just 10 general steps for everyone who comes into contact with the centre. You can say, here you go, here's your digital professionalism policy, and you need to adhere by these at least 10 steps. So these are the really practical things, like educators will not upload, post, forward, or post a link of any derogatory or inflammatory content that is being potentially a dispute, that could cause a dispute within the centre. You're not posting any personal social media accounts that negatively reflect the centre. All communication is done via the intranet or communication platform. You're not friending people from other families or from families within the centre. Your discussions on social media should not involve other persons. Educators should not use their own personal photographic or video equipment to use within the centre. They should use a designated equipment. Online conversations would be considered as evidence. And educators should be aware on how they conduct themselves through chat to ensure they've always on a professional standard. So all of the practical 10 steps that you're going to make is part of your policy. We'll give you some more examples on your procedure I know I keep saying that over and over, but in our interactive collab. Your scope is a really very quick sentence about who the policy applies to. So you're just going to say, this policy applies to all educators, visitors, casual staff, and management of the service. And it's a very short sentence. Your legislation or regulatory construct, which acts and laws apply to this policy, lists them as dot points. So again, these are just short, sharp dot points of what laws apply within your particular policy. So when you have a look at your procedure and you've talked about photographic, not taking photos of children that you're not meant to be taking photos of, or posting them in a way that's deemed out of the policy, what particular law does that connect to? Is it some sort of privacy law, Child Protection Act, Australian Children's Education Quality, the CEQA outline, or anything within the early years framework? So this particular group have Privacy Act, Code of Ethics and Code of Conduct, Education and National Services Act, Information Privacy Act, Education and Care Services Regulation of 2011, and it goes on. So you're just listing the particular laws and strategies that apply to your particular procedure, and we'll walk you through that too. Now this has got a little bit confusing last time because it says sources, and this is like a reference list. It's not your reference list that you normally give us. You're going to have two reference lists. You're going to have a full reference list of all of the references you included in parts 1, 2, and 3, like you normally would with a normal assignment. However, if you have used some policies or laws or research just to write your own policy, you're going to have a little sources list. So obviously everything that's included in your part 3 will then again be included in the full reference list, as well as your parts 1 and 2. Apologies if that's confusing. We will break it down again, and I'll show you some real examples in our interactive collab. Your last one is a little is your authorization and review. Who needs to authorize this policy? How and when will it be reviewed? So you're just going to say that the policy is in a drafting process and that feedback and input from the stakeholders will be considered, and it's a continual review process So you don't need to be specific about when the policy will be reviewed again, but you'll just outline that it will be reviewed, because policies are just always continually being reviewed. So you can say that your policy will be authorised by the particular management and leaders within your EC setting, and that it will continually be reviewed. You don't need to give specific dates. You just need to say that it's important for policy to be continually updated, and it will be considered again. If you want to say it'll be considered again in a year or 2 years, it's up to you, but you don't need to be specific on dates. Your last one is that your responsibility as a team member. I know that team tasks can cause anxiety amongst students, and I know that there's some students who are keen to start straight away due to work commitments and family commitments and perhaps commitments to other units, so please be mindful of this. Communication is really the key here. A lot of issues happen when people don't communicate. So if you have an assessment on and you haven't gotten back to your team members about this assessment, it's okay, just communicate with them. I know a lot of the frustration last time happened because someone had gotten behind in their work. They were too embarrassed to email their team and let them know they hadn't done it yet. They were probably worried about the reaction, but just saying nothing probably made it worse. So their teammates had emailed them 5 or 6 times and that person wasn't getting back to them, and it just added to the frustration. So, you know, I'm sure the team members will be really understanding if you just let them know what's going on. So please communicate. Please let people know. Even if you need a little bit more time to work on something, just communicate that and let the team know where you're up to, and keep the lines of communication open, I suppose. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you in the Interactive Collab in week 7.